I want us to become brothers again like we used to be, and for us to find ourselves and bond with each other. Can we agree to that?
Opinions vary.
Welcome to Three Brothers Filmcast. I'm Anton, and I'm here with my brothers,
Anders and Aaron.
My last name is the same as my brother's.
And today, for our 33rd episode, we are going to take a trip down memory lane and revisit a landmark early work in the career of George Lucas.
And here we go.
Like magically becoming a prince in a fairy tale, the financial success and cultural phenomenon of the original Star Wars has been both a blessing and a curse for George Lucas. Obviously, being a billionaire and the creator of a beloved movie franchise has immense benefits. At the same time, many of us can also see that Lucas has never quite escaped the shadow of the original film, with each move in his subsequent career being weighed and measured against something that attained more success than anyone had dreamed. But few today remember George Lucas before Star Wars, especially as anything other than a movie nerd trying to make his space opera. For today, we're going to set aside the story of Lucas's feature debut, THX 1138, an avant-garde dystopia both deeply alienating and profound, that absolutely deserves reevaluation. We're also not going to talk about the George Lucas who is going to make a Vietnam epic for Francis Ford Coppola called Apocalypse Now. Instead, we're going to talk about a masterpiece of American cinema that has almost fallen off the map of cinematic discourse in the 21st century. This is a movie that ranks 77th on the AFI's 100 Greatest American Movies of All Time list in 1998. This is a movie that was nominated for 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Director, and Screenplay. This is also one of the most financially successful films of all time in terms of investment based on production costs versus box office returns. It's the movie that made George Lucas a millionaire. We're going to talk about a film that is one of the quintessential coming-of-age movies, offering sociological insight into a group of teenagers in a specific time and place like few films have, and that should be revisited as often as Richard Linklater's Dazed and Confused. And like Dazed and Confused, here's a movie that boasts a killer pop soundtrack and a cast of youthful yet recognizable faces, including that of Richard Dreyfuss, Ron or Ronnie Howard as he's credited, Cindy Williams, and Harrison Ford. We are going to talk about a film that is also an experiment in narration, telling 4 stories simultaneously in a manner that was not typical at the time. The film also tries to convey the feeling of the real passage of time over one night, having affinities not only to the works of Linklater, but also the French New Wave, in particular Agnes Varda's Cleo from 5 to 7. We are going to talk about a film that is also an experiment in sound design, with the great Walter Murch working on the sound montage. This is one of the first films, after 1969's Easy Rider, to rely solely on a jukebox pop soundtrack, actually preceding by 2 months Martin Scorsese's Mean Streets, a director in his work that receives far more credit for this. But here, we get the added effect of the soundtrack resembling a single radio broadcast by real radio legend Wolfman Jack, in a manner that far precedes Quentin Tarantino's radio cut soundtracks for both Reservoir Dogs and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Lucas actually wrote each scene for his screenplay with a different record in mind. Today, we're going to be talking about American Graffiti, which was released widely to American cinemas just over 50 years ago on August 11th, 1973.
Okay, Ramblers, let's get rambling.
Grab that special one and jump into your candy-colored custom or your screaming machine, cruise downtown and catch American Graffiti.
American Graffiti. Baby, what's that?
It's a movie.
Can you dig it? Can you dig it?
Go back in time.
Where were you in 62?
Is that you in that beautiful car? Jeez, what a waste of machinery.
Anders, Aaron, I'm going to start things off with a more specific question than a general do you like it kind of thing. So here's a film that I think is one of the great summer teen movies. This year I watched Dazed and Confused the weekend my kids' school let out, and then I watched American Graffiti this past weekend as the feeling of the end of summer and back to school begins to creep into the darker evenings and crisper breezes. This is a film that just aches with that feeling of the end of summer vacation and the advent of changes in one's life. So here's my question to you. What do you think of American Graffiti as a teen movie and as a summer vacation movie? Does it work for you, even though it's 50 years old and depicts a world that is closer to 70 or 80 years old?
So the thing about American Graffiti as a teen movie and as a summer movie, which do come really hand in hand, because when you stop being a teen, you stop having summers, right?
Yeah.
Like it's something that dies once you become an adult, and your relationship to that time period always becomes different, even if the actual summer months are enjoyable. So the movie on the one hand has this kind of evocation of atmosphere, which doesn't really matter that it's set in the early 60s. It feels like, to me, it feels like those kind of quiet summer nights at the end of August in Saskatoon where, yeah, you do have actually people cruising around in their cars and you have some people trying to like get alcohol, but mostly people just kind of putzing on the edge of parks or like around school grounds, but not really going into them. And you have that idea of time seems to have raced away and kind of all the grains of sand have fallen out of the glass, but it also, time seems frozen. It's this weird middle space, this limbo. And I think that's one of the huge strengths of the movie, having this kind of indistinct all in one night timeline where it doesn't really have like a ticking clock. It doesn't remind you of what the time is aside from the radio broadcast and the fact that at one point, Wolfman Jack goes off the air. But, and there's the whole thing of like, in the morning, we got to catch the plane. In the morning, we got to catch the plane. But it's not like, 4 hours till my plane. 6 hours till my, like,
Yeah, it has that stretched out sense of time. And you're right that there's something about, later August, kind of around now, where, your plans for summer are kind of over, but you haven't yet started the September, all the business of September. And you're sort of like, you do have it's almost a more reflective time in a way, because you can think back over the previous year. And it's, it's very much also, in some ways, like September is like the new year, especially if you're an academic. But, I've always sort of felt academics. Like just as much a sense of like a year turning and beginning again around, that late August, early September as I do, on sort of a regular calendar sense.
One of the things the film that I think is very elegant in its the way it treats end of summer and the end of childhood and teenagehood, right? The film is not just about the end of summer; it's about the end of these young people's high school careers and the question of whether they go off to college. And so there's a way in which the sort of end of summer moments and that frozen moment kind of is echoed in the choices that the characters have to make. And this idea of whether, going to college, that kind of stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's actually a very, insightful, pairing that Lucas does in this film of suggesting that the end of high school is a little bit like the end of summer, even though we don't always think of high school in that way. It is like before we really begin the next step, right? So it's a threshold. Yeah. It's a threshold of time in terms of the seasons, but it's also a threshold in terms of life choices.
But it's a different, I think it's important that Lucas selects, late August as the time, right before they're going to get on their plane to go out to college, rather than set this after their high school graduation in, June, July, when you still have like 2 months, and then they would be talking about like, oh, we got 2 months to figure things out, where now this is like pushing everything up against that threshold. So Kurt, is really getting cold feet on wanting to go to that time. But in also the other interesting thing, and I brought up the comparison to Dazed and Confused, right? That's a last day of school movie. Right? It's the day that school lets out, and then the big party then. And when everyone goes to bed in the morning hours in that film, there's the sense that there's things that will have to be worked out next year, but there's this nice big space of time ahead of you. And the characters like, this summer we just got to worry about getting Guns N' Roses tickets and like things like that. And the one guy like puts on his headphones and reclines back in bed. Whereas this movie, it that part of the summer is already done. And I think you're very right. So that accentuates that the threshold is here now. It can't be put off for a couple of months to figure things out. And then the plane itself also makes it so that, you actually have something that you have to get on and go somewhere. Mm-hmm. But how do you think of it as just like a teen movie? Does it work as a teen movie? Does it seem real as a teen movie?
I hadn't watched it in a while. I mean, I watched it about 5 years ago, and before that I hadn't seen it in a long time. So 5 years ago, I was reminded of the technical prowess of the film and how great it is. This time, I was struck actually more by some of the, I don't know, I mean, I guess people today would say vibes, or like the feelings of the film. Yeah. calls to mind, but also its sort of maturity and sort of more thematic issues. It is a nostalgic film in a really
sure.
true sense when you mention, right? But not in a
not in a trite
one
way.
of the things about American Graffiti that it always gets wrapped up with was that in the late 70s and early 80s, there was a lot of media that was looking back at the 50s and early 60s with that strong sense. As the boomers aged, and they
Happy
remembered
Days.
their
It's
child,
Happy Days.
Yeah, Happy Days. Because it's
And
literally,
of course,
especially Ron Howard,
yeah,
right?
And even
it's hard.
Cindy Williams, I think, was also on Happy Days at some point.
Oh, yeah. So there's really that strong connection, but I don't think anyone.
This is not Happy Days.
No one would call this movie Happy Days. There's a. It's nostalgia in the true sense of the. I think of the Don Draper.
Teddy told me that in Greek, nostalgia literally means the pain from an old wound. It's a twinge in your heart, far more powerful than memory alone. This device isn't a spaceship. It's a time machine. It goes backwards and forwards. It takes us to a place where we ache to go again.
Right, and this shows.
But you still have affection for that.
Yeah, but there's a strong affection. I'm like, I kind of love all these characters, even if they're like screw ups and goofuses, And it's like even Steve, who, he's not really like Richie Cunningham on Happy Days. He's a bit more, Steve's kind of a jerk.
Totally.
And Laurie's probably right to be like, frustrated with him. So the film here, in terms of nostalgia, is really focused on. It doesn't sugarcoat it. There's a tinge of darkness to this film, in a number of ways, but not in a like kind of like way that I'm like it's kind of dark and sad, but at the same time I'm like I absolutely felt that like that pang, that like longing for like that moment where everything is just about to happen, but it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, but it's not. It's also not Rebel Without a Cause.
No.
This is a movie that's trying to be realistic in its portrayal of like teens, and it's not like, Rebel Without a Cause is going to it's going to melodrama, and it's also melodrama, and it's also like tragic, right? Like it's and I was struck in an interview how like Lucas was like, we like the studio early on was like, we want like we got to like increase, we need more like sex, we need some more like action. Why don't we have like them play chicken and things like this? And he's like, no, like people didn't actually play chicken the way like movies have it.
And also how much of the pursuit of girls when you're young, for all the talk people do, it's like most of the time it ends up being nothing. But it's that the pursuit itself is the excitement,
spending all night to just like try to like meet some girls and like kind of getting nowhere. I just feel like that's so accurate in so many ways.
It's interesting because it's a threshold film in its setting. It's a threshold film by the fact that it's about teens. It's also a threshold film because it's transitioning between what we understand of like Hollywood teen dramas of the 50s and 60s and then teen dramas of the 80s, right? Mm-hmm. And it's in that weird period where New Hollywood's not something we typically associate with teen stories at all. It takes until you get to, Animal House isn't quite a teen movie, but it's a college movie. And then you get into the 80s where Animal House sets the template for like kind of the frat comedy. And then you have the downgraded versions that are a little more PG with like John Hughes and stuff, right?
Yeah.
And it's funny looking at this movie where, compare it to Rebel Without a Cause, compare it to Blackboard Jungle, compare it to the Wild One and things like that. It doesn't fit those teen movies of the 50s at all.
There's no moral panic here.
There's no moral panic, but there's also no idea of like crisis or a conventional Hollywood narrative structure. But it's also not entirely transitioned over into that pure entertainment aspect that you get later. But it's also, it's nostalgic and in that true sense, as you said, Anders, but also a little bit somber and a little bit sad about growing up. But it is also kind of a sex comedy without sex.
Yep.
All of Toad's plot
Yeah, Terry
is
the
essentially just it's
Failed
just what you
attempts
get
to
later
get
with
girls.
Revenge of the Nerds. It's like, but that amplifies it, right?
Yeah.
So it's a funny movie where it ripples back it's reflecting upon the time period before and the types of movies, but offering a more honest depiction of it made by the people who lived it. Because it's Lucas drawing on a lot of his own life experience and cruising in Modesto and growing up there and not really having much to do, but that not really being a problem, but feeling like you're getting nowhere, even though you're driving everywhere. But it also ripples forward because you get it not only bringing about a nostalgia wave in the 70s, which I always think of specifically the opening narration in Phantom of the Paradise, which is another nostalgia wave movie that comes after this, right? Brian De Palma's rock opera, where there's
Who's a friend of Lucas's,
yeah, but you get the opening narration where it's like,
his band, the Juicy Fruits, single-handedly gave birth to the nostalgia wave in the 70s.
Things like that. And, it's referencing American Graffiti, spawning that. And you have the opening song of that's supposed to be like Greaser stuff, right?
Yeah.
Which is, again, riffing on American Graffiti. But then you ripple forward, you get Dazed and Confused. But then you get all these comedies where it's this idea of like, well, what are teens about? Teens are about sex. They're about booze. They're about a good time. They're about upsetting their parents. And the movies of the 80s, again, bring that into a conventional plot structure.
Mm-hmm.
They like pragmatize, they make it like a program that they can then
programmatic,
fit. Yeah, programmatic, and they can fit things into it. And this movie, again, it's a transition era out of the programmatic melodrama into the programmatic comedy. And it's at the threshold of the two, but with neither being really dialed up, even though it's a very funny movie or a very dramatic movie at moments. Like, you think of the serious conversations between Laurie and Steve about their relationship. Like, Steve is making like enormous life decisions based off of some realizations of how he's acting is not really how he actually feels. And the movie does the classic conventional thing that it became a convention, I think, after that, where Kurt talks about constantly, I don't want to go, but he's the one who's actually much more open to the newness in life.
Mm-hmm.
And Steve is the one, I have the plan, but he's actually scared of it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think so many movies after that have taken it. It's just interesting how much this movie on a production level, on its pop culture impact, as a George Lucas movie, as a nostalgia film, but also as the template for the teen hangout movie. It's so influential, but in all directions. And it embodies its own themes within its nature, within like Hollywood history. It's just a fascinating movie that people, as you say in your keynote, people need to go back and watch this movie and think of it as one of the great movies of the 70s.
I think I'd even go even further. I'd say that a lot of times we conflate the boomer generation into the hippie generation.
Yeah.
But this is a movie about the older boomers who came of age right before the hippie movement.
These are the Joe Biden.
But they were still but it's right actually right as like the notion of the teenager is still fresh. Because remember, this movie is made just 4 years after the Summer of Love, the collapse of the hippie generation, the famous, the wave that just crested, as Hunter S. Thompson said, but here we still get the first kind of generation of real teenagers. And one of the things that I'm reminded of also in this film is that they're still kids.
Yeah.
They're still kids. They're still immature. And the idea of this teenager as this creation of Hollywood and consumer culture and things like that and rock and roll is coming into being. But it hasn't like fixed yet entirely. And so there's a freshness and a like honesty in the movie that comes through to me. And that's partly why it's okay with being like kind of like sad a little bit.
Yeah.
At the same time, I don't know. When I watched this movie again, I was like struck by like how amazing it is in a lot of ways on thematics. So
I think what's really interesting is how fresh and real this movie feels. And it's interesting because this is a movie that, like we've talked about, how it lays the template for so many sort of conventions of like different kind of teen movies afterwards. But I think some of its freshness comes from the fact that it's like, as Aaron sort of said, right, like this liminality within the film, but also the fact that it's a movie that's like serious, but also light. That's like characters making big decisions, but it's also not, except for, a car crash. It's not like life or death. Like the stakes for the characters seem real. Nothing seems amplified and exaggerated. And I think an interesting comparison point would be, right, so Francis Ford Coppola came on to be the producer of this. Francis Ford Coppola in the 80s made, an adaptation of The Outsiders and did his own teen movie about greasers. That movie is
Peggy Sue Got Married too.
Yeah. The Outsiders is a really good movie with an amazing cast as well.
Oh yeah.
But it's operatic.
It's melodrama again.
Because the hint in novel.
And it's going back, and it's going back, you're right, to the melodrama of the 50s. In that movie, everything seems like, the rumble is like an epic battle. Here, I'm struck by how like muted but raw and realistic like the final race is. Like it passes in like 10 seconds and then it's over, and then we get this like handheld camera work moving around the characters in this great like moment where sort of things start to get tied up, and the whole movie just it seems realistic, partly because it finds the balance between the seriousness and lightness and the sort of appropriate stakes of like a regular person's life.
So watching the movie now as a 40-year-old man, the movie is very different from how I kind of, when I first saw it and when I first like got into its mythology as a George Lucas fan.
Yeah, as someone originally watching it is just like, we got to see like, Lucas's
previous films. And one of the interesting things is the character played by Harrison Ford.
Yeah, in
this film, Bob Falfa. I remember Star Wars fans made a big deal about the mysterious guy in the cool hat in the car. His initials are BF, right? Boba Fett. But Bob Falfa is kind of just a regular dude. He's actually not like the big scary villain in a way. Like watching it now, I'm like, oh, he's maybe a bit older than them, but he's just a car dude, and he wants
just another car dude trying to
and so as you say, like there's stakes, but they're realistic, and he's not actually like the big bad,
And we don't get a scene where he's like throwing drinks in people's faces and just being like an obnoxious, like ridiculous baddie, so that we
and there's not like, as you mentioned, The Outsiders. There's no scene with like Patrick Swayze doing a backflip off a fence or anything.
Yeah, or people just getting knifed and like lying dead, bleeding out.
No,
it's Tom Cruise who does the backflip.
Oh, Tom Cruise.
Oh yeah, and he's like, wow. Yeah, it's just like it's like really whooping. High.
Which voice. One of the great actors in that movie?
No, it's such a stacked cast.
So good.
What's the man? So many of the key teen movies have such stacked casts, right? Like this, Dazed and Confused, Outsiders, like these all have like, and they're all, so many of them are like the beginnings of the people's career. So it's great for that too. But sorry,
and they're all looking back. Yeah, all those movies. They're not set in the time periods they're made.
That's true.
Well, because they're about the teenage years of the people who made them,
of the director.
Mm-hmm. But even and that's that backwards looking thing is even nowadays. How many teen movies are set in the previous, even if it's just 10 years before. I think of something like Perks of Being a Wallflower. It's like that movie's set in the 90s. It's not set in the 2000s when it was made.
Or we could say Greta Gerwig's first feature, Lady Bird, set in 2001, 2002.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
That fits.
So
that
again,
fits in the template.
Yeah, and it's also in Northern California, Sacramento. Yeah, she's from there. Yeah, right. So the film also like so we've been talking a lot about the thematic aspects of it, but I think that the film is a really good merging of form and content in a lot of ways. Like formally, this film, I was like struck by how good it is. Like the lighting, the sound. We can spend a lot of time talking about the sound, and I think we should, but like the lighting, I love the lighting in this movie. Like
in this movie,
the nighttime shots, cars like coming out of diners, the street lights, all that. There are moments, and like the way he frames it, even like it's almost like it's like reminds me of like a Wong Kar-wai movie. It's like you can enjoy those like backdrops and like the wash of light and color and all that.
Let's start this conversation with the fact that this film is severely underappreciated for its technical and like formal accomplishment, and how influential and important it is. Like when I was doing some research for this keynote in my review, like I knew that Lucas was like innovating and doing some stuff here, but I feel like I totally didn't realize the impact it actually had in, so some of the things just, doing them really well, like that sort of, the natural lighting. Like I think originally in the first couple of days of shooting, Lucas was like using no extra lights and literally just trying to use like the street lights and stuff. And it like wasn't turning out because he didn't have a director of photography at the time. He was just using 2 cameramen because they had 2 cameras working. And then he had to bring in
Haskell Wexler.
Yeah, Haskell Wexler. Yeah. So who he knew from USC to come in and help with so they were like adding lights into spaces to make it look natural, but give a little bit more. So they're rigging some lights on the street lights. They're asking some shopkeeper, do you mind to just keep your shop lights on here so we can get a little bit of light coming out, and it all still sort of looks real.
Totally.
But then the sound
there's a deep naturalism to it,
even
though it's not really stuff, obviously.
Yeah, but like the radio stuff, this is sorry. Yeah, you want to do you want a photography before, but I'm just like the radio stuff. Like Lucas did this first, and we don't give him credit for that.
No, the soundtrack's amazing in terms of the way it's integrated into the film.
The only thing I could think of before is potentially Targets. Bogdanovich's Targets, which uses the radio music as a key because it's telling about the rampage in between the songs, but it's not the same.
And as a key intertext for a film that Anton, you already mentioned,
yeah,
Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Yeah, and Easy Rider also had a soundtrack that was entirely contemporary pop music, rock music.
But the music in this movie is all diegetic. That is, it's meant to be coming from the radios, and it sounds like that. It's like sometimes
and they literally
re-recorded it, washed over. Yeah.
So they would go, Walter Murch and Lucas would go play the record, right? So when Lucas wrote this, he had a stack of his records from his record collection from when he was growing up, and he selected a record and he would write it into the screenplay. So you could see in the screenplay, this scene is about this this is the soundtrack for this scene. It had to change a little bit as they were editing it, but so he conceived it as essentially, I think the thing that makes it a little bit different from Targets is that it's almost like a musical. Like he's writing scenes around the specific song in a way that in some ways reminds me of what Wes Anderson often does, where you can tell that Wes Anderson had this particular pop song in mind when he's writing it, because the marriage between the actual screenplay is not like they're just find me a song that fits here. The writer has a specific song in mind. But yeah, and then so they're recording songs out of let's play this record now, and we'll play it out of a radio to capture that moment. And there's a scene where it's the same song. I forget the song, but Kurt's in the car with his ex-girlfriend. You can hear the song low. Actually, it's Barbara Ann, the Beach Boys, and it's playing on the radio, quiet. And then they kick him out of the car, and then it kicks into a non-diegetic version of the song. And it's and it sounds different. And it's just things like that, he manipulate, or they talk about how they, during the dance scene, there was also an example of this time where they, when Steve and Laurie have to go up and dance in front of everyone, where again, they switched away from sort of a diegetic sound to capture a more lush romantic, but it's very complicated what they're trying to do with these. It's records.
They're trying to make it the way that music actually feels for people who are very invested in pop music, where you move between the reality of what it sounds like to listen to something through grainy radios and record players and AM radio of the time, but then the way it sounds in your head too.
Yeah.
Right. Where it just fills you and you move back and forth fluidly through that, and that feels actually more real and more immediate than anything else you could do there.
And there's an impressionistic aspect to that, right? Because it's trying to convey sort of as you sort of said, the subjective appreciation of that music. So sometimes you hear it kind of just as something there external to you, and then sometimes it's within you, you're hearing it around you.
And then it all culminates in the meeting of Wolfman Jack, and right. and the whole like the play around his identity and stuff like that, which is really great.
I can't talk for the Wolfman, but I can tell you one thing. If the Wolfman was here, he'd say, get your ass in gear. The Wolfman comes in here occasionally, bringing tapes, to check up on me and whatnot. Yeah. And the places he talks about that he's been, the things he's seen. There's a great, big, beautiful world out there.
I think there's also an editorial stylization here that's, because it's so invisible, because it comes across as so realistic in its tempo, it's understated, or like somebody would not quite realize what it is doing in the way that the scenes are intercut and just how it maintains this kind of realistic pace. And the thing I keep thinking about again, and you mentioned this in the keynote, but it's how much this film learns the lessons from the French New Wave of how to edit and how to create that break. So the French New Wave like breaks down the conventions of old Hollywood, uses some of them, and it like reinvents them in new ways that it partially was for the sake of budgetary reasons, right?
Yep.
Like these movies, they didn't have much money. They were filming without permits. They were doing it slapdash, and they were a bit of rebels in that way. But then it was also like an experimental thing where they wanted to just see what the form could do in like a pure theatrical sense. And the thing that often leaves me cold, which we talked about last year when Godard died, is like Godard often seems to be doing things because he's like tickled by the concept, not because it actually has an effect on the viewer. It's like he has himself first in mind, and then whatever effect it might have on the viewer is incidental, which is it's a classic artist thing, but it doesn't make it necessarily like a great work of audience art. And American Graffiti is like a mainstream film. It is a film that has its effect, it wants to have an effect on the audience in a way that it's not just like impressive as an experiment or some kind of evocation of something. It actually wants to be like a moving story that people see their own pasts in. And so American Graffiti is a movie that takes these kind of temporal rhythms, this kind of low-key lighting effect, this idea of mimicking the sound out of a radio, right? Or the sound of a car on the street, or the kind of little imperfections of reality, and baking those into a Hollywood story, quote unquote. But it also isn't just doing it because Lucas is like theoretically interested in something, right? He's connecting it back to the Hollywood impulse of telling a story to an audience to make them feel something. Whenever I rag on certain new wave films, and I do love certain new wave films, but it's the fact that I always find the movies that learned the lessons from the new wave films better than the new wave films. They're like, their importance is in their legacy, not so much in the actual individual films in my mind. But something like American Graffiti shows how influential they are and how important they are, but it actually like betters them. Like consider the scene in Band of Outsiders where they have the whole jukebox dance and he like cuts the music, and it's like, that's cute, it's fun, Godard is playing with the way that you do it's capturing that kind of like lazy spirit of like, hey, why is a movie just taking a minute for characters to dance? It's like, well, because sometimes like people do that, right? People want to like goof for a moment, and the movies are never been allowed to indulge in that, the idea of like, let's just follow the character in their fancy and completely shut out every other consideration. But isn't it more fun to actually like hear the song and be invested in it while also indulging those like real moments? It like takes it a step further.
I think that, I think the new wave movie I mentioned, right, Cleo from 5 to 7, is a good example of one that is innovating formally with its play of like trying to capture kind of real time, but does that for like a solid narrative purpose, and in how it's trying to reveal certain things about the characters by structuring it in that sense. And that's why, I used it as a reference point to this. Something I'll also say is that, one of the, in the interview, I was watching the making of American Graffiti, and with the interview with Lucas, and I thought this was actually a really good comment about his own works, but he pointed to both this movie and Star Wars and was like, people forget because both movies are so successful and have influenced what's come after, that what they were doing when they first came out was like pushing Hollywood mainstream in a different direction. So like a movie like this seems so conventional in so many ways, only because it was so successful, and the patterns have like conformed to what was going on. Same thing with, right, like sort of Star
In
Wars
some
stuff.
ways, right? But like the same thing I'll say about this that I'll say about Star Wars is like the imitators rarely, if ever, hit that thing that makes this one special. Like this movie doesn't feel like all its imitators. This movie feels way more raw. It feels, I think the new wave comparisons, my Wong Kar-wai comparison, these things are far more evoking what this movie is doing than like a John Hughes film or something like that, right? Like this movie is focused on different things, even if it's circling around the same concept that is the teenager as a 20th century sort of construction of like temporal, adolescent, longing and maturity. It's in terms of its formal techniques and things, it's far different.
It is.
Take any still,
But the things I'm thinking about would be more like broad things, which I think are often replicated, maybe not as well. But you're like telling a story, 4 stories intercut, and they're not really interacting that often with each other. At that point in time, like 72, when they're making this, the studio was very uncomfortable with the idea. They were like, well, you should just tell one of them and then tell the next one and then tell the next one. Or how the way that Star Wars has its perfect, like, and this character leads you to this character, leads you to this character, leads you to this character. And that's the through line. By that point in the new Hollywood 70s and 77, it was not conventional for a film to have a narrative that was so linear that everything led to the next thing, which led to the next thing. But I totally agree that, both the films, and again, sometimes to their detractors will pick out the features which are done worse in later things. It's like the whole sort of like, what I would say the tired argument, that Jaws and Star Wars ruined Hollywood by bringing in the blockbuster. And you're like, well, no, if I had as many more Star Wars and Jaws blockbusters, we wouldn't be having a problem.
Right on that, don't you? So to your point of this movie being underrated, don't you think that the issue with us, not us in terms of us three, but us as in terms of a film culture, we should not be talking about Jaws and Star Wars. We should be talking about American Graffiti and Jaws and Star Wars inventing Hollywood as it is today.
Yeah.
Like it is literally as important as those two films.
And people forget
in its own
that,
way.
like,
it was the highest grossing film based on budget for years.
No, it's not even just box office. It's like we've talked over and over here. Essentially every movie about teenagers made after it is influenced by it. And when cinema for a while became all about teen movies, and you could argue now all movies are teen movies essentially.
or
now
preteen.
Yeah, children's films.
This is
teens
why
are children.
but this goes back to something that I said earlier, which is that this film is a film about teenagers who are about to leave that world.
Yeah.
That when they leave Modesto or the stand-in town for college, for the war, for whatever's going to happen next, the dark parts of the 60s that are going to follow, they won't be kids anymore. And our culture is all people who are only kids, who never have to leave that. So how can you make a teen movie?
In the return,
when 40-year-olds essentially have the same concerns and interests that the 18-year-olds in 1962 had.
So it's the Stranger Things 80s, where the 80s becomes a playground for your, like, your adolescent fantasies of adults, And again, like, I like aspects about Stranger Things. It's just
totally.
But like what I mean is there's something that's shallow about that nostalgia in comparison to this. And I actually wonder.
But it's not even a value judgment. It's just simply a statement of fact that people are no longer expected or even encouraged to move on beyond things. So you cannot have a threshold crossing. If anything, it happens when you're, in a Judd Apatow movie when you're 35 and you already got 2 kids, and now you're having your life crisis of
You've prevented a hero's journey possibility.
Yeah, but it's interesting how this film has a nostalgic artifact, as a nostalgic experience for the viewers at the time, and for us. For us, it's an imagined past in that it's something we didn't experience. But it's like, if you ever want to feel like you're living in this early 60s, this movie's about as close as you can get. In the way that, when I watched Nashville a few years ago for the first time, it's like, if I ever want to experience the mid 70s, like country music, that movie is as close to time travel as we're ever going to get.
That's actually a great comparison movie, actually, to this in some ways.
It does, but that's the thing, is that it's people, again, because Altman is Altman, he never quote unquote sold out the way Lucas did. So the idea of like, you can praise all day, every day, The Long Goodbye and Nashville and McCabe and Mrs. Miller and stuff for their bold narrative gambits and their realism, and the fact that they are playing against conventions and inventing this new cinematic language with all the tools of the old. But like, nobody ever talks about American Graffiti in the same kind of breathless, oh my goodness, this movie I could watch all day, every day. I can never get old,
Yeah.
And like, just what an awesome hangout movie, and like, what a vibe, and blah, blah, blah. It's just, I don't know. Is it because also the fact that the movie it's not corny, but like, it's not really trying to be cool. It's not interesting. It's literally just
because
interesting.
Teenagers aren't cool.
No,
that's
they're not.
The main thing.
And the characters are trying so hard to be cool. Like,
exactly.
John, the whole film is like begging to be considered the coolest guy in the world.
Yeah. But like, so cool is also an artifact of,
and that's what makes it great when he's saddled with Carol. It's because he has to confront that he's not cool.
It can't be cool because the film is from an era when cool as we conceive it now doesn't like exist, and you have the beginnings of it with some of the greaser stuff. But but cool is the term of the counterculture, and this is purposely trying to depict a culture just before that comes into
proto cool,
a proto cool. But like,
not a medium cool like director Haskell Wexler would do later.
I want to actually pick up on another reference, Anders, you mentioned, but like Wong Kar-wai, because watching this film this time around, I was struck by its sadness, or just sort of like its depth of feeling. And again, like, it's not like magnified and exaggerated. So it's easy
like emo.
It's easy to overlook that it is. But I also don't think that the movie's like sentimental or sappy.
No,
and
I find one of the realities.
I do think what almost makes the movie, or does make the movie, in a sense of, and it would be a different movie. I do think that final titles, which tell what happened to the characters, has a huge impact on how we like read the whole film. And like, this time around watching it, when it just like mentions like, and so like, John's dead, Terry, this little nerdy guy, is somewhere in the jungle or dead, like these things, you're just like, oh, like shit. You're just like, it captures, by doing that, it also taps into that feeling of, well, the first audience is watching this, in 73, looking back, knowing people, that's this, everyone would identify with some aspect of that story. I'm Steve, I'm Kurt, or I knew Terry, I knew John. But like, it even works today, because you're like, when you look back on that, it's that moment when you're looking back, whether nowadays it's sort of Facebook, but you're just like, oh, like that's what happened to that person from high school, or my friend, like, who I haven't been in touch with for a couple of years. And you're like, oh, like, it just gets into all that stuff that it's so, in a sense, it's so universal. Like, it's just the changes of life and, what happens after the fact. But you're like, it just is a great at getting into that.
But for all the romanticism of the later 60s, it also shows like how much like the references to the war. And there's a sort of sense also like this film was made right at the like end of the first Nixon administration, and moving into the second, and the sort of cynicism that was sort of taking root there, and recognizing that, we can criticize the sort of staid conservatism of the 50s and early Kennedy administration, but at the same time, it's like they didn't know what was about to hit them. Like the world, not only it's very important that those young people are coming of age right at that moment. In the next year, you would have the president assassinated, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the like go on and on. The Vietnam War escalated, all that stuff.
Yeah, no, and Lucas is engaging. Like, I think he's very interested. It influences what he's doing with Star Wars, his reading of the progression from the 50s, 60s to 70s. But I feel like with this film, with all his films, his strongest interest in all this, like he does have a political interest in these things, but it's that sense, that sort of general sense of kind of like the culture that he really like. I don't think Lucas would be so naive to be like, like this 1960 was such an innocent time. That's not exactly what he's trying to say, but it's more of like people, like these young people sort of thought their life was something, and what they thought about their life, maybe that there's a shift by the time you get to the end of the 60s and what they think of their life, their country, and where things are at, right? Because then, Star Wars is its own reaction with the perceived cynicism of his time period.
Yeah.
And then THX, in his own way, his first film, is also him trying to distill his concerns and perceptions about his time period into a dystopia. But it's not a future. That movie is not a future forecast. It's a movie about 1971.
Listen, I don't think I'm gonna be going tomorrow.
Come on, what are you talking about?
Well, I was thinking I could wait a year, go to city for a while.
You chicken
Oh,
thing.
wait a minute.
After all we went through to get accepted, we're finally getting out of this turkey town, and now you want to crawl back into your cell, right? You want to end up like John. You just can't stay 17 forever. You've got to get that through your head.
I just need some time.
I gotta go talk to Lori. Now take it. Take it. We're leaving in the morning, all right? We're leaving in the morning.
So Lucas says that he's like, 3 of the characters are him. That he, in his freshman years of like high school, he's Terry. And then he became John because Lucas was a big
car guy.
Big car guy. And I feel like I don't hold this as significantly as I should when I think of Lucas's career. And you're like, oh, so pod racer, George Lucas, pod racer. Like,
it's working!
His,
ships, the details of
of the ships. And also like he nearly died in like a car crash. And you're like, just so like when he does that in a film, there's when he does it in American Graffiti, when there's crashes and stuff, that actually has like an extra layer of meaning when he's like telling that in his story. But and then he was Kurt because he was the one who left the town, and I guess he doesn't self-identify with Steve the same way, which is partly why he brought he had some help from his friends, the other 2 screenwriters, Gloria Katz and Willard Hayek, to help with fleshing out that storyline. But it's interesting. But I just bring that up because it's like when you watch this movie, like these sort of teen ensemble movies, I feel like we always see ourselves a bit, or you just like or dislike certain characters. And I feel like this time around, for the longest time when I would watch this movie, I just felt like John, like I didn't know what to make of him in a sense. But this time around, I like really noticed how much the guy like aches for like, like everything he says is about like the decline of things. He's like, oh, rock and roll's been going downhill since Buddy Holly died. This strip, used to drive it and you could just drive it forever. And now it's shrinking. Like just, everything's a sigh. And like, the character really worked for me this time around. I feel like the first time you watch it, like Terry's just so funny. Like,
I really like Kurt. Kurt.
Well, Richard Dreyfuss. It's hard not to really like Dreyfuss in the 70s. It's so good.
Yeah, he might almost be like the definitive like young man of the 70s. If you just go across all of his films. Because even in Jaws, he's young. Even in Close Encounters, he's the young father. And I haven't seen the W. Kravitz movie yet. I need to. After I read the book.
I should. But for great
but
Canadian
from the
film.
novel, I can just assume.
Oh, yeah, I could just see him in it so well.
like in this time period, I could just like watch him. Like I find his performances, the young Dreyfus, like so fascinating and like so compelling. It's got such a great energy. Like Ron Howard's good in it. And I think
But
he's
I probably
like
am like
perfectly
the most
cast.
annoyed with Steve.
Yeah. Well, Steve has a lot of jerk moves, right? Like, well, like you're the one for me, but I still want to see other people when we go away. Like things like it's just, he's someone who like, he's like the, class president. He's like, everyone in the town knows who he is. And he's kind of like generally popular. And I feel like it's someone who like everyone assumes has grand plans, but he clearly kind of doesn't, and doesn't. I think deep down he doesn't really know what he wants. In a way that Kurt
exactly
says that he doesn't know what he wants, but the movie's about Kurt reminding himself through meeting the wizard Wolfman Jack that this is what I want.
Yeah. Okay, I'm a bit harsh on Steve. Like I do think he's a jerk. I do think he doesn't know, but then I actually feel sorry a little bit for Steve. Like in the sense of like we've all known people like that. They're a lot more talk than they are anything else, and he needs to learn something.
Do you think that Terry the Toad is more than just kind of like a nerd?
Oh, definitely.
He's not just like the.
He's not just comic relief. No,
yeah.
He's a very particular type of person that I think that the social dynamics of young people push them into particular roles as well.
Yeah,
it's funny that watching it this time because I always, when I was younger, I recognized Dreyfus and Howard the most, so I kind of gravitated towards them. And if I'm being honest, I'm definitely in a high school sense, I'm definitely the most like Steve. Like if you were to take a 17-year-old me, I had these grand plans. I was kind of full of myself, and I probably still am. But but like everybody at the school, but everybody at the school knew who I was. Everybody was like, "Oh, Aaron's he's got a plan," kind of thing. And like everybody, was I the most popular kid? No, but it was that kind of just general sense of like he's got his stuff together, and he's like, you can assume Steve's like a straight A student and things like that.
And the
right?
local Saskatoon Lodge would definitely love you, and
yeah. Well, no, they give the money to Kurt though.
They give the money to Kurt, but I'm pretty sure like I feel like Steve is the like one who like did all the work for.
Yeah, but it's funny this time watching it and appreciating like you, Anton, John a lot more. And I think it's partially that Paul LeMatt's performance is like it's full of affectation, but it comes across as so honest. Like there's a weird reactiveness to his performance that is so earnest that like you just like the guy.
That's because they're the affectations of the character, not the actor.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. The actor's completely credible. But also, is it just me, or does he really seem like a weird cross between Walter Koenig, who plays Chekhov, and Casey Affleck?
So
I'm not
recast it? No,
but I was getting really weird, almost Affleck vibes with it. And
I can
it's
see the
partially
Casey
the way
Affleck.
he
I can see the
looks.
Affleck a bit, yeah.
No, but it's also just like he kind of looks like a really young Walter Koenig.
Well, I was watching.
I've been watching Star Trek. So.
Well, I was watching To Die For, and it has a young Casey Affleck in it. It's sort of like this rebellious teenager with the Nicole Kidman, Gus Van Sant movie. And no, so I could see him actually playing that sort of a role. I haven't watched original Trek, not just the movie. Like I'm thinking of
no, he's too old in the movies.
No, exactly. I'm just thinking of him in the movies.
Young.
That's my picture.
Because remember, he's Chekhov's Manson. Anyways, but the Casey Affleck thing, and it partially is because Casey Affleck is a performer with he's a very distinct voice. They both have that kind of like, they're very masculine, but it's a higher voice and it's a little bit nasally. And then it's also the twitchiness. It's the idea that there's like this energy and so for John, the energy is being channeled into the car, and that's why he's wandering. He's wandering constantly. He needs something because he can't find anything. So I just think it's like a really compelling performance, and he's a really likable character, even though he's more childish than he lets on. And that's why Carol's so fascinating too. And
one point, I just think that I believe Paul LeMatt was like a boxer. And I feel like you can see it in that sort of like the reactions, like the very fast reactions to things. And then of course in the scene where he sort of goes in to help
Yeah.
her and is giving the little punches quick, but just the way he sort of holds himself and the you sort of said like almost that jumpy reaction to things around him.
Yeah,
But
it's
anyway.
just too much energy, and there's a rhythm to the performance, the rhythm to the lines, the rhythm to the way he holds his body. But no, the other the thing I was going to say is that weirdly enough, looking back at a younger version of me, Carol's the character. I absolutely, the first time I came across this movie, she's the one that I associate myself most with, because she's the one who, you know, a 12-year-old me looks at you guys having your adventures with your friends and it's like, I just want to tag along. What are you guys doing out there? Like, there's all this fun to be had right outside the door at nighttime, and it's not for me. And, you know, and then you get more, she gets more than she thinks she's going to get when she does it. But it's so, again, it's so like, there's something so emotionally relatable to the way that the characters act and express themselves without really, they never speechify about it. It's just like, it's the way that performances work. It's the way that they're like, look at each other and how they react in situations. It's just, it's so nostalgic.
So what I'll also say on characters, so I really like the Bear TV show. I'm watching the second season, and one of the comments I have about that show is that I think it's a show that is very generous to all of its characters. And I actually think this is a very rare thing nowadays where a film or a story or a TV show is generous to all the characters. Not just some or most, but not a few. And I feel like us talking through the characters in this, I was like, I think this film is that way because, you know, Carol could just be annoying, but there's a lot more going on with that character. As Anders said, you know, the Harrison Ford's Hot Rodder could just be this obnoxious villain, but he's not. And even the scene where, which was cut from the original version, but Lucas put back in, where he's like singing some, he's like singing to Lori. I forget like the song he's singing. It's from like, you know, some musical or something, but he's singing in that low voice, you know, he's like doing that to her. And you're like, who is this guy? Like it allows a moment of just sort of like, he's like, this is also just a kid too. And he's like kind of trying to impress / like joke with her and just get like a reaction from her at that moment. And it's a film that like, and then we even meet like the Greaser gang. And they could just be kind of like either
the Pharaohs. You're gonna join
the Pharaohs, you know. And again, even like you get a little bit more time with the Pharaohs. That it's not just kept to like a pure stereotype. You know, I just feel like all the characters, Lucas, it's written in a way that like Lucas is not trying to say like this is sort of a good character, this is a bad, and the film itself. Even though when we watch the film, we will judge what the characters do as people do when we observe things, as we've talked about, Steve, the film itself is not setting everything up for judgment, its own judgment about like who's the good character, who's the bad character, who made the right acceptable choice or not. And I just feel like it's rare today. And the reason I brought up the Bears, I just find it rare today where I find you get a large sort of ensemble cast and it's open to all of them. Usually there's a few that they're holding judgment on.
You really only get that in great art, I think, really.
Yeah,
because the show that immediately came to mind for me is Better Call Saul, where there's characters who are completely incidental, and the show, like Howard Hamlin, there's the perfect example. That show is like so sympathetic to Howard as a character who's, you think he's like just a dismissive joke at the beginning of the show, and then by the end it's like a very tragic approach to that. And it's just this movie, every character you come across, even Debbie, who's kind of goofy and kind of a caricature, but she's also like, she's there for her own reasons and her own good time, right? And she's after her own things. And it's just, the movie doesn't have this idea that any of them are doing it wrong, because it also understands that none of them are doing it right. That's why at the end of it all comes back to Kurt, who's Kurt's great realization, which is also the realization that we as the audience come to, is you have to discover it as you go along. Like literally, life is only lived forward. It's understood backwards. It's lived forward, and the fact that you don't know what comes next is the exciting aspect of it, not the scary part.
Oh, stay cool, man, and don't do anything I wouldn't do. I'll see you, buddy.
I know, you probably think you're a
big shot going off like this. But you're still a punk. Okay, John. So long. So long.
See ya.
We'll see ya.
Bye, Kurt.
See you later. All right. Have a good trip.
Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time.
Goodbye, Mr. Bond.
I bid you farewell.